Ethically Speaking, a UCF interdisciplinary series on contemporary moral issues. My name is Steve Kubler, and I'm the organizer of this series, and I'm professor of chemistry and optics and founding associate director of the Center for Ethics at the University of Central Florida. In this event, Dr. Matt Liao will discuss the emerging role of AI in healthcare. But before we introduce Dr. Liao, I'd like to say a few words about our speaker series and how you can participate. Ethically Speaking is organized by the UCF Center for Ethics with my collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Beaver, who's Associate Professor of Ethics and Digital Culture and founding director of the Center for Ethics. We developed Ethically Speaking to promote conversations about challenging issues of our time. We encourage you to visit the center's website at ethicscenter.research.ucf.edu to learn more about our activities and to find out about other speakers in our series. We would also like to hear your feedback and your ideas for future talks in Ethically Speaking. Ethics connects to every facet of our professional and personal lives, and you can see that from the long list of partners who co-sponsor this series that ethics is central to the work that we do at UCF. And all of us in this partnership hope you enjoy the discussions in Ethically Speaking. We hope it cultivates understanding of how ethics provides frameworks for making better decisions, particularly when there are competing values. Today's presentation is being recorded, and we will post a link of the recording at the Center for Ethics website so you can view it again and share it with others. And at the end of the presentation, Dr. Liao will take questions moderated by Dr. Beaver. Submit your questions during the talk directly to Dr. Beaver via chat. And if we have time for your question, he'll invite you to unmute and pose your questions. So now I'll turn it over to Dr. Beaver to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Dr. Kubler. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor S. Matthew Liao, who's the director of the Center for Bioethics and Arthur Zintrin Professor of Bioethics in New York University School of Global Public Health. He also holds multiple other affiliate positions in philosophy, environmental studies, and the School of Medicine. Dr. Liao completed his DPhil in philosophy at the University of Oxford and has held several highly esteemed positions in ethics and bioethics, including a Shapiro Research Fellowship at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton, a Greenwall Research Fellowship at Johns Hopkins University, and a visiting research position at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown. He currently serves in several high-profile capacities, including as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Moral Philosophy, an editorial board member of the American Journal of Bioethics, and an elected fellow of the Hastings Center, the prestigious Bioethics Research Institute. As a researcher, Dr. Liao has published several articles on a range of issues, from epistemology and metaphysics to ethics and bioethics, and is the author of The Right to be Loved, a 2015 book out of Oxford University Press. Beyond his impressive credentials on his own, Dr. Liao's work strives to engage others in ethics discourse. To that end, he's edited 4 additional volumes of work, including The Philosophical Foundations of Human Rights in 2015, Moral Brains, The Neuroscience of Morality in 2016, Current Controversies in Bioethics, also in 2016, and most recently, The Ethics of Artificial Intelligence in 2020. Each of these volumes brings together key and emerging scholars in engaging contemporary ethical issues. Central to his research and his teaching is the emphasis of bioethics as the intersections of medical ethics and environmental concerns, which I see as the foundation of a public health ethics, which is the direction of his research and his institutional situation. His work is a reminder and a challenge that understanding contemporary ethical issues is both at once richly interdisciplinary and centered squarely in normative theories, epistemological perspectives, and the metaphysical framing that's at the heart of philosophy. I'm very grateful to have him here with us today to share his expertise and perspective with us on the ethics of AI and healthcare. Please join me in offering our warmest digital welcomes to Dr. S. Matthew Liao.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Jonathan and Stephen. And thank you, you and Stephen both for having me here today. It's a great honor and pleasure. Do you want me to launch right into the talk of the day?
Please do, the floor is yours.
Great, I'm gonna share my screen. So I'm gonna try to do that right now. Okay. Okay, I hope everybody can see that.
Looks great.
So there's enormous interest in using AI in healthcare contexts. AI applications have begun to diagnose some types of cancer better than doctors, identify heart rhythm abnormalities like cardiologists, diagnose various eye diseases as well as ophthalmologists, and identify viable embryos as fertility specialists do. But before AI can be used in clinical settings, we need to make sure that companies and AI researchers follow appropriate ethical frameworks and guidelines when developing these technologies. And in recent years, a great number of ethical frameworks for AI have been proposed. Today, there are over 80 such frameworks from private companies, governmental agencies, academic research institutions, and intergovernmental and other organizations. Now, these frameworks have some recommendations in common. So for instance, many draw on the 4 principles of biomedical ethics: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So for example, autonomy seeks to ensure that patients and consumers are fully informed of and understand the risks and benefits of a particular AI health technology and voluntarily consents to it. Beneficence aims to guarantee that AI health applications promote the well-being of patients and that of society as a whole. Non-maleficence strives to ensure that AI health technologies do not impose undue harm on patients. And justice seeks to promote the fair and equitable distribution of the benefits and burdens of AI health technologies among individuals and society. And in addition to these 4 principles, many frameworks also list such recommendations as transparency, explicability, and trust, given that some forms of AI are not fully understood easily, if at all, even by those who program them. And I'll come back to this point shortly. Now, at the same time, many organizations also offer their own distinct recommendations. So for instance, this is the Future of Life Institute, and it lists, among other things, value alignment. And that says that highly autonomous AI systems should be designed so that their goals and behaviors are aligned with human values. Or here's Microsoft, and it recommends inclusiveness. And that says that AI systems should empower everyone and engage people. Now, in one sense, it's welcome news that these organizations cared enough about ethics to put forward these frameworks and guidelines. But in another sense, however, this proliferation of ethical frameworks has created confusion from which pressing questions arise. For example, how were these particular sets of recommendations developed and not others? Which recommendations should AI developers and organizations follow, and why? And more fundamentally, what grounds and justifies these recommendations? How do we distinguish between recommendations that are genuine from those that are not? And importantly, how do we use these recommendations in practice? So for instance, it seems reasonable that we should not impose undue harm on patients. But how do we actually do this? Or it seems reasonable that we should be able to trust an AI system, but how do we decide which AI systems to trust? Now, unfortunately, most of these AI ethics frameworks have been silent on these questions. And so they've actually been criticized for offering abstract, high-level principles that in practice have provided few concrete guidance. And moreover, some people are worried that these frameworks are merely forms of ethics washing and virtue signaling, where organizations and companies exaggerate their interest in ethical AI as public relations exercise, and maybe to forestall governmental regulation. So to meet such worries, we therefore need an AI ethics framework that is grounded in substantive normative theory. one that can help us assess whether a recommendation is genuine or not, and one that can give us concrete guidance. And so elsewhere, I've developed what I call the fundamental conditions approach to human rights, according to which, and this says that human beings have human rights to the fundamental conditions for pursuing a good life. And I've applied this approach to some issues in research ethics and in biomedical ethics, as well as to ethics of AI generally. And what I want to do today is to argue that this approach can also be extended to the use of AI in healthcare. So I'm going to illustrate how this approach can help us evaluate the merits of a given recommendation and how it can also help AI researchers and companies identify distinct ethical considerations that they might encounter. So to get started, let me first say something about what AI is and how current forms of AI can give rise to ethical problems. So there's no agreed upon definition of AI. For our purpose today, we can understand AI broadly as getting machines to do things that, when intelligent beings such as humans do them, require cognitive functions such as thinking, learning, and problem solving. And AI can take many forms. So one form is what's called symbolic AI. And that basically uses a series of explicitly programmed if-then rules and statements to establish the relations between inputs and outputs. Another form of AI is machine learning, and that uses algorithms to learn from data without being explicitly programmed to do so. Now, within machine learning, one can distinguish between supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. So supervised learning is where an algorithm is trained on a data set where you already know what the right answers are, and the data are labeled accordingly. And once the algorithms learns the relationship between inputs and outputs, it can then apply what it has learned to predict the correct answer in a different target data set. In unsupervised learning, a given data set has not been labeled, and an algorithm aims to sort the data on its own. In reinforcement learning, a reinforcement learning agent attempts to learn through experience. The algorithm rewards the agent if it succeeds in a task, and or punishes the agent if it fails. And so through some sort of trial and error, the agent strives to maximize the long-term reward. And all these methods can be combined with something called deep learning, which basically uses different layers of nodes to detect increasingly abstract features, which maximize information capture while minimizing losses in predictive accuracy. Okay, so as impressive as machine learning is, it suffers a number of limitations, which can give rise to a host of ethical issues. So for one thing, machine learning needs a lot of data to work well. So for example, supervised learning algorithms can fine-tune themselves and achieve great predictive power when they have access to a vast amount of data. So as a result, this basically incentivizes companies and organizations to harvest or buy data, including very sensitive personal data. And even when doing so might violate an individual's right to privacy. So one example of this is when the Royal Free NHS Foundation Trust gave the personal data of about 1.6 million patients to Google DeepMind in 2017. And they were trying to test a novel way of detecting kidney injuries without, but they didn't properly inform the patients about how their health data will be used. In another case is when the drug maker GlaxoSmithKline bought the exclusive rights to mine the genetic data of customers of 23andMe, which is sort of a DNA testing service. Now, secondly, machine learning is only as good as the data from which it learns. So if a machine learning algorithm is trained on inadequate or inaccurate data, then that algorithm is going to make bad predictions, even if it's well designed. So this is known as the garbage in, garbage out problem. So for instance, algorithms trained on gender imbalanced medical imaging data sets have been found to do worse at reading the chest x-rays for an underrepresented gender. And similarly, there are reasons to be concerned that skin cancer detection algorithms may not do as well detecting the skin cancer affecting people with darker skin, because many of these algorithms are trained primarily on lighter skinned individuals. Now, thirdly, even if a machine learning algorithm receives adequate or inaccurate data, if the algorithm itself is bad, it's also going to make bad predictions. So for instance, a bad machine learning algorithm may identify a pattern even when there isn't one, and a problem known as overfitting. Or it may fail to identify a pattern even when there is one, a problem known as underfitting. An algorithm may also give too much or too little weight to certain features, or fail to include certain features altogether. And these faulty algorithms can have serious ethical implications. So for example, an algorithm used widely in US hospitals to determine which patient should get extra care was found to discriminate against Black people because it used health costs as proxy for health needs. And because of structural inequalities, Black patients often spend less on healthcare than white patients. And as a result, the algorithm falsely concluded that Black patients were healthier than equally sick white patients. Or in 2016, the Arkansas Department of Human Services began to use an algorithm tool to determine how many hours of home care some people with disabilities should receive. And the algorithm caused many people to be hospitalized because it had incorrectly coded conditions such as cerebral palsy and had not accounted for conditions such as diabetes. Now, fourth, as I noted earlier, deep learning is a black box that raises issues such as interpretability, explainability, and trust. And deep learning is impenetrable even to its programmers because it typically employs thousands or sometimes millions of connections that interact with one another in very complex ways. So as a result, it's difficult to interpret what those interactions mean. And the issue of explainability arises because we often need to know how a decision is made, but the deep learning doesn't really explain how it arrives at its prediction. And this could be a problem because, say, a deep learning algorithm says that there's a 70% chance that Jay's tumor is going to become malignant in 5 years. The deep learning algorithm doesn't say, for example, that there's a 70% chance that Jay's tumor is going to be malignant in 5 years because Jay has a history of cancer, is over 50 years old, and has lower back pain. Now, without such explanation, the doctor would be then able to explain to Jay why his tumor is likely to become malignant. Beyond explainability, this also raises the issue of trust in a deep learning system because we don't know whether it makes predictions on reasonable and reliable grounds. And so for very high stake decisions in healthcare, not being able to trust the deep learning system is especially problematic. So are there ways to address or mitigate this problem, this black box problem? Well, some AI researchers are currently exploring technical fixes such as interpretable machine learning. So one such method involves adding deep learning models to deep learning models an additional layer after the hidden layer of nodes and before the output. And the idea here is that this added layer would provide information about which features were the most important ones for arriving at a particular prediction. And the hope is that this information would then make the deep learning system more interpretable. But there are a number of issues with this approach. So one is that since it's placed outside of the black box, this additional layer provides a kind of post hoc explanation of the black box after it's already made its decision. So you might wonder whether this post hoc explanation would actually give us the actual reasons why a black box gave the predictions that it did. So the concern here can be put in the form of a kind of a dilemma. So either the predictions are based on these post hoc explanations or they're not. So if the predictions are not based on these post hoc explanations, you might wonder what's the value of these explanations. They might just be a kind of post hoc rationalization that doesn't really correspond to how the black box works. Now, suppose instead that the predictions are based on these post hoc explanations, then presumably it should be possible to design a new model using just these post hoc explanations. But if that's the case, then that means we can just get rid of the black box. And in fact, this suggests a way to test the value of these interpretable machine learning systems. And if the black box remains indispensable for making predictions, as and this is an empirical question, but I'm inclined to think that that's going to be the case, this suggests that the post hoc explanations have not really given us all the relevant features or explanations of why a black box gave the kind of explanation that it did. So other people have proposed that maybe we should care more about accuracy than interpretability in medicine. So as long as it works, we don't really need to know how it works. Now, some people have said that clinicians also prescribe medications without really fully understanding why these medications work. So for instance, aspirin has been prescribed for nearly a century, and some people have suggested that we still right now don't really understand how aspirin works. Now, however, while we may not fully understand how medications work in many cases, we do have some ideas regarding the causal mechanisms through which they work. So for example, we know that something from a willow causes fevers and pains to be reduced, even if we did not know about salicylic acid, which is an active ingredient in the production of aspirin. This contrasts with a machine learning system, which works through associations and is, at least for now, unable to track causal relations. And to see why this matters, it's helpful to point out that machine learning is vulnerable to certain kinds of adversarial attacks. So for instance, deep neural networks are vulnerable to, and this is called the one pixel attack. So in one study, the researchers were able to get the deep learning algorithms to classify an image of a ship as a car just by changing one pixel in an image, right? So here it's predicting with 99.7% confidence that it's a car when in fact it's a ship. The researchers found that such a one pixel attack is successful on nearly 3/4 of standard training images, and that altering even more pixels made this type of attack even more effective. In another study, researchers made a 0.04% change to the pixel value in an input image, so about 400 pixels out of 1 million. And these changes were imperceptible, as you can see, to the human eye. Nevertheless, the deep neural network classified a panda as a gibbon with 99.3% confidence. And recently, researchers have shown that this type of adversarial attacks can also be done on medical machine learning. So the fact that deep learning neural networks are vulnerable to adversarial attacks suggests that these networks are not really learning the real features of the world, such as causal relations or what a macro level object like a panda really is. Instead, these deep learning systems are only learning superficial features. And for our purpose, if these networks can be tricked in these ways, issues of explainability and trust remain highly relevant, especially in high-stake domains such as medicine, where humans could be harmed. So in sum, given all the ways that a machine learning could fail, it's critical that companies and AI researchers have an appropriate ethical framework that they can follow when developing these technologies. So now I'm going to say something about the fundamental conditions approach that I mentioned earlier. And I'll do that by explaining why human beings have the human rights to the fundamental conditions for pursuing a good life. And I'll also show how, I'll then go on to show how this approach can help us in this particular case. So the fundamental conditions for pursuing a good life are various goods, capacities, and options that humans, qua humans, need, whatever else they qua individuals might need in order to pursue basic activities. So as I see it, a good life is one spent in pursuing basic activities. So such as deep personal relationships with one's partner, friends, parents, children, knowledge of the workings of the world, of oneself, of others, and active pleasures such as creative work and play, and passive pleasures such as appreciating beauty. And so the fundamental conditions are these things that are needed to pursue those things. And the fundamental goods are, for example, resources that humans need in order to sustain themselves corporally, such as food, water, and air. The fundamental capacities are powers and abilities that humans need in order to pursue the basic activities. So they include the capacity to think, to be motivated by facts, to choose and act freely, so that's liberty, to appreciate the worth of something, and to have control of the direction of one's life, so autonomy. And the fundamental options are basically those social forms and institutions that human beings need to exercise these capacities. Now, these fundamental conditions for pursuing a good life ground human rights because having these conditions is of fundamental importance to human beings, and because rights can offer very powerful protection to those who possess them. And the former is true because if anything is of fundamental importance to human beings, then pursuing a characteristically good human life is. It seems clear that if we attach a certain importance to an end, we should attach that importance to the essential means to this end. So given this, since pursuing a good life is of fundamental importance to human beings, having the fundamental conditions for pursuing a good life must also be of fundamental importance to human beings. That rights can offer powerful protection to those who possess them is well known. So by their nature, rights secure the interests of the right holders by requiring others, the duty bearers, to perform certain services for them or not to interfere with their pursuit of their essential interests. In addition, at least on certain structural account of rights, rights typically prevent the right holder's interests that ground rights from being part of a first order utilitarian calculus. And what this means is that if a right holder has a right to something, then typically no non-right claims can override the right holder's right to that thing. And finally, as some writers have pointed out, because right holders are entitled to these services as a matter of rights, this means that the right holders can simply expect these services without requesting them. So given the strong protections that rights can offer for the right holders, and given the importance of having the fundamental conditions to human beings, it seems reasonable that human beings have rights to these fundamental conditions. So if this is right, this gives us a reason for thinking why human beings have human rights to the fundamental conditions for pursuing a good life. Now, the fundamental conditions approach can explain why many of the recommendations found in various AI ethics frameworks are genuine ethical principles. So take, for example, autonomy, found in many such frameworks. And that basically requires patients to be fully informed of and understand the risks and benefits of particular AI health applications. Well, the fundamental conditions approach can readily explain and justify this principle. As noted earlier, autonomy is being able to control the direction of one's life, and it's one of the fundamental conditions. To be able to control the direction of one's life in the context of AI healthcare, one needs to be informed of and understand the risks and benefits of a particular AI health application. And the use of this technology needs to be voluntary. So the fundamental conditions approach therefore implies that patients have a right to have sufficient information and the time to decide whether to use a particular AI health application, and a right to make that decision without being coerced or exploited. Likewise, take non-maleficence, which is also found in many frameworks. And this seeks to ensure that AI health applications do not impose undue harm on the patients. Again, the fundamental conditions approach can explain and justify this principle. If patients were to experience harm when using a particular AI health application, this would undermine their ability to pursue the basic activities. The fundamental conditions approach therefore implies that patients have a right not to have such harm imposed on them unnecessarily, and which means that companies and AI researchers should do whatever they can to minimize the risks of harm to patients. However, the fundamental conditions approach would also exclude some of the recommendations that we've seen as genuine ethical principles. So to take an example, take value alignment. And remember, that says that highly autonomous AI systems should be designed so that their goals and behaviors are aligned with human values. Now, many people endorse this recommendation because they are concerned that AI systems are soon going to outpace humans, and they want to ensure that algorithms are designed in such a way that they won't harm humanity. Now, while this is a very laudable goal, it's not clear that AI systems should be designed so that their goals and behaviors align with human values, given that human values vary very widely, and only some of them are good. Now, while many people would regard Mother Teresa as a moral exemplar, there are others who would not and would instead regard autocratic dictators and racists as moral exemplars. Nevertheless, AI systems should not be designed so that their goals and behaviors are aligned with the values of those who prefer autocrats or racists. But there's a more plausible principle in the vicinity, and which is that AI systems should be designed so that their goals and behaviors respect persons or humanity as ends in themselves, as Kant said. Now, the fundamental conditions approach can explain why this would be a genuine ethical principle on the ground that having our moral status as persons respected is a fundamental condition for pursuing the basic activities. Indeed, if our moral status as persons were not respected, then others would be at liberty to use us as a mere means to their own end. If so, we would not have the kind of control necessary to determine the direction of our lives. In any case, this shows that the fundamental conditions approach can be used to distinguish genuine ethical principles from those that are not. Now, the fundamental conditions approach doesn't just give us a substantive ethical framework for determining which recommendations are genuine ethical principles and for explaining why they're genuine ethical principles. As I'm now going to illustrate, it also offers AI researchers in healthcare a helpful framework for identifying distinct ethical considerations that they might encounter and for explaining and justifying those ethical considerations. So in healthcare, to give an example, in healthcare, there's a spectrum in which algorithms can be deployed, ranging from inside the human organism to outside of it. So the former might include a smart pill injected into the body to monitor vital signs, while the latter might involve processing data from an imaging device that detects skin cancer. The fact that a particular healthcare algorithm will be placed inside a human organism can raise distinct ethical considerations. So here's one. Such an algorithm can directly and negatively impact a human being's basic health. So basic health, as I understand it, is the adequate functioning of various parts of our organism that are needed for the development and exercise of our fundamental capacities, such as the capacity to think. So for example, there are various life processes, things like respiration, digestion, absorption, metabolism, circulation, and various organ systems, the nervous system, skeletal system, cardiovascular system, and so on, that make up and enable and sustain these fundamental capacities. These parts of our organism must function adequately for us to develop and exercise the fundamental capacities. And it should be clear that algorithms that operate inside the human organism can directly and negatively impact our important life processes. So indeed, a smart pill inside our body could deliver the wrong drugs or deliver the right drugs, but at the wrong time, thereby disrupting and possibly damaging various life processes. So for our purpose, the fundamental conditions approach can explain why basic health is an ethical consideration that we should take seriously. So basic health is something that humans, qua human beings need, whatever else they, qua individuals might need in order to pursue the good life. Indeed, without basic health, human beings would not possess the fundamental capacities, and without possessing the fundamental capacities, they would not be unable to pursue a good life. So as such, basic health is a fundamental condition for pursuing a good life. And earlier I said that human beings have human rights to the fundamental conditions for pursuing a good life. So it follows that human beings have a human right to basic health. So the fundamental conditions approach tells us to take basic health seriously because it's a human right. That human beings have this right means that they have a right not to be exposed to an undue risk of something such as a healthcare algorithm that can negatively impact their basic health. Here's another consideration. To get healthcare algorithms to operate inside an organism, you have to put it into someone's body. But bodily integrity is also a fundamental condition because without control over our body, we would not be able to pursue a good life. So on the fundamental conditions approach, we also have a right to bodily integrity. So the fundamental conditions offers another approach offers another reason why we should be more cautious when developing healthcare algorithms inside a human body, namely because there's the potential to undermine someone's right to bodily integrity. Let me give another example of how the fundamental conditions approach can help identify distinct ethical considerations that AI researchers in healthcare might encounter. So here's another spectrum in which healthcare algorithms can be deployed. So from those that are designed to assist humans in their decision-making to those that are capable of making decisions on their own. So an example of the former might be algorithms that can recommend potential medical diagnosis. Physicians can then elect to incorporate these diagnoses into their decisions about how to treat patients. An example of the latter might be a robot surgeon designed to make incisions and perform surgery without any human input or control. Now, with respect to healthcare algorithms that enhance but do not replace human decision-making, so they're just assisting us, we remain in control of how these algorithms are used. And what this means is that we can choose not to use these algorithms if doing so happens not to align with our preferences, or if we believe that doing so could cause harm and violate the rights of others. But with algorithms that make their own decisions independently, we may no longer be fully in control of them once they're deployed. And among other things, this can result in these algorithms inadvertently going against our preferences or values and exposing others to harm without our being able to stop them. So the fundamental conditions approach implies that algorithms that can operate autonomously would require distinct scrutiny because they could inadvertently subject others to harm and violate the rights of others without our inputs. So interestingly, the healthcare algorithms can be deployed on both spectrums at the same time, resulting in at least 4 types of combined algorithms. So here you have type 1, basically inside the organism and make its own decision. Type 2, it's outside the human organism, but also makes its own decisions. Type 3, you have an algorithm that's inside an organism, but it's only an input into our decision making. And then you have type 4, which is outside a human organism, and it's only an input to human decision making. So some examples of type 1 might be sort of next generation brain-computer interfaces or smart pills, both of which would operate inside a human organism and be able to make independent decisions without human input. Some examples of type 2 might include the next generation robot surgeons or robot caretakers, both of which would operate outside a human organism, but could make decisions on their own without our input. An example of type 3 might be AI-powered in vivo biosensors that can continuously monitor the biological life processes inside our organism and provide this information to physicians for further analysis. And an example of type 4 might be AI-enabled radiology assistance, which can improve diagnostic accuracy. Now, for our purpose, the fundamental conditions approach can help us see that ethical considerations we identified earlier could remain, even when these algorithms are deployed on both spectrums. To give just one example, take a next generation BCI that's going to operate inside a human organism and can make decisions without our input. The fundamental conditions approach tells us that we should make sure that such a device would not violate the right to basic health and the right to bodily integrity, and also that it should not inadvertently cause harm to others. So I'm now going to show that being able to identify the kinds of ethical considerations that one might encounter with respect to a particular healthcare algorithm can help us decide how it should be developed and implemented. So as we have seen, a pressing problem with current iterations of deep learning systems is that their learning is in some sense superficial. That is, they do not learn about real features of the world, such as causal relations. And as a result, deep learning is prone to getting things seriously wrong, as its vulnerability to adversarial attacks suggests. So what can we do to reduce the risk of algorithms going astray in the healthcare context? Well, there are at least 2 options. The first is to hold the algorithms fixed so that they give the same results whenever they are provided with the same inputs. Or as the FDA puts it, to use something called locked algorithms. Now, by contrast, adaptive algorithms are able to learn continuously, which means that for a given set of inputs, the outputs may change as the learning process is updated. A second option is to hold the environment in which the algorithms operate is fixed and allow for the use of adaptive algorithms. So take, for example, next generation robotic surgeons. Say we like to use adaptive algorithms in such surgeons. We may be able to reduce the risk of the algorithms going astray by holding the environment in which they operate fixed. So for example, we might just allow a robotic surgeon only to perform tasks that it can do with a high degree of accuracy, such as incisions or suturing. But in many healthcare applications, it may be difficult to hold fixed the environment in which the algorithms operate. Since many such applications involve the human organism, the life processes of which are in constant flux and therefore difficult to hold fixed. So given this, it seems that the first option, basically locking the algorithm, may be preferable for many types of healthcare algorithms in the near term. So earlier we identified 4 types of algorithms, right? Here they are, I won't repeat them. Based on the ethical considerations we have identified, it seems that there are good reasons to use locked algorithms, at least with respect to types 1 to 3. So for example, say a healthcare algorithm would be operating inside a human organism and be making its own decisions. Well, to ensure that the basic health and bodily integrity of patients remain uncompromised and they're not inadvertently harmed, it seems that other things being equal, we should use algorithms that provide the same output whenever they're given the same input. So locked algorithms. Likewise, there's a prima facie reason to use locked algorithms in cases where algorithms outside of the human organism would be making their own decisions, since they could go against our preferences and values or cause harm without our being able to stop them. Similarly, in cases in which the algorithms would simply assist human decision-making, but would do so inside the human organism, there's also a prima facie reason to use locked algorithms, since they could affect the patient's basic health and bodily integrity. Now, as far as I can tell, the ethical considerations that we've identified do not seem to apply to type 4 algorithms, which serve as mere inputs into human decision-making and operate outside the human organism. Now, this, of course, just to make clear, does not mean that there are not other ethical considerations that apply to type 4 algorithms. However, even though we should use only locked algorithms in type 1 to 3, we may still be able to take advantage of adaptive algorithms through what might be called staggered learning. So staggered learning involves allowing adaptive algorithms to learn and generate new input-output relations, but not to apply that new learning synchronously. Once the new connections between inputs and outputs have been verified and validated, maybe through randomized control trials, they could then be used to develop a new updated locked algorithm. So in this way, learning could still occur, but would be done in steps. So the idea here is that maybe you can have locked algorithms and adaptive algorithms be run at the same time, and where the adaptive algorithms are collecting data, but you're actually not using it as an input right away. You use it later after it has been verified. Okay, so let me just conclude. Countless private companies, governmental agencies, academic institutions have proposed ethical frameworks for AI, but they don't really explain how these recommendations are justified or how we might be able to distinguish between genuine and ethical principles and those that are not. In this talk, I propose that the fundamental conditions approach can give us a more unified and substantive AI ethics framework and can help us address these issues. I also suggested that the fundamental conditions approach offers a helpful framework for identifying distinct ethical considerations that companies and AI researchers might encounter, and for explaining and justifying those considerations. Since current iterations of deep learning learn superficially, I also propose that the fundamental conditions approach implies that many healthcare algorithms should be locked, at least for now, but we can still take advantage of adaptive learning algorithms through staggered learning. The fundamental conditions approach offers a novel and substantive ethical framework for AI in healthcare, and I think deserves to be investigated further in future discussions on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Liao.
Just stop broadcasting. Did I stop broadcasting? Yep.
You did, yeah, everything looks great.
Okay.
I've been having a fun time collecting and collating questions for you. And I want to say to our audience, if anybody has a question that pops into their mind during the Q&A, feel free to raise your hand in Zoom or send me a message, and we'll just we'll take your questions as they come. But the questions that came during your talk, Dr. Liao, came kind of in 3 buckets, maybe. One is about the limits of AI. So that's one bucket. We've got some questions. One is about your fundamental conditions approach, and the third is about ethical AI more broadly. And so I might sort of work through them in that order, if that's okay with you.
Sounds great.
Perfect. Okay. So the first question that came from Dr. Kubler actually was a question about physicians and misdiagnosis. So he writes, we know human physicians misdiagnose all the time, and they also disagree on diagnosis and prognosis. Given that, what's a reasonable expectation for accuracy from a medical AI, and how do we establish those limits?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so, you know, the way I like to think about that issue is that humans make mistakes. That's why we're interested in maybe using AIs so that maybe there could be fewer mistakes, right? But some of our mistakes are, so then we need to distinguish between the types of mistakes. Some are just sort of inadvertent mistakes, right? But others are more deeper, and we can kind of talk about those ones as well. But what we do know is that we understand why, like when we make superficial mistakes, we know why we made those mistakes. And when we have disagreements about certain things, we know why we have disagreements. We have reasons for why we disagree, right? And the problem with AI algorithms, as I was trying to suggest with the adversarial tax, is that we don't really get the reasons, right? We don't really understand like whether this is a mistake, and if so, why it's a mistake. Like the AIs don't really tell us that. And fundamentally, that's the problem, right? It doesn't give us causal relations. It doesn't sort of tell us, you know, about these things. And so, so given these types of algorithms, then we're faced with a choice. Okay, so maybe it's kind of accurate, but we don't know. We don't really know how accurate it is. So it could be accurate for this case, but then for a bunch of other cases, not accurate. So let me just give a different example outside of healthcare context. So right now, there's a lot of interest in, say, self-driving cars, for example, okay? So self-driving cars obviously need to be able to read stop signs, right? And most of them can read stop signs. But it turns out that you can do natural adversarial attacks on stop signs. So there have been studies where if you just put a banana sticker, a sticker of a banana on a stop sign, then the self-driving car algorithm can't recognize the stop sign anymore. And that's a big problem. Like the sticker, if you just look at it, for us, it's very easy for us to say, oh, that's a stop sign with a sticker on it. But the car algorithm cannot do that. And that's a big problem. So.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think the other thing that snuck into Dr. Kubler's question was this idea of reasonableness, right? That we can, when we make what you described as superficial mistakes, we can explain those through a process of reasoning, and we can expect one another to make those kind of mistakes, but it's because of their explicability. So your response led me to two other questions that had come up, and I'm going to bounce around for a minute. One of those is about explicability, and the other is, interestingly, about self-driving cars. So I'll start with
Okay.
This question was the typing of AI as an intervention tool seems entirely analogous to those used to classify levels of autonomy in self-driving vehicles. So how do those two classifications differ, if they do, on a fundamental level? So what's the difference between classification of self-driving cars and AI intervention?
Yeah, so I don't think there's, you know, I had this thing about sort of whether algorithm is going to make decisions on its own versus whether it's just input into our decisions. And I think it's the same. So self-driving cars are trying to reach a point where it can make decisions on its own, and when or on their own. And when and insofar as they're trying to do that, it raises similar issues that, you know, as sort of healthcare algorithms that are trying to also make decisions on their own. And so there are a lot of people who say, well, maybe humans need to be able to kind of intervene. You know, maybe sometimes, like say in a self-driving car, if there's going to be, say, an ethical decision, say the car's driving down, it's about to hit 5 people, right? And you can divert it, killing the passenger. Maybe I'll alert you, right? Sort of like, hey, do you want this to be done or something like that? But the problem is, you know, but of course the issue is sometimes you have to make those decisions, like split-second decisions. And so that might not happen. So it seems like we have to pre-program these cars to act in one way versus another, and that's an issue. Like that's a whole another set of issues. But the bigger thing is that whenever we're ceding control to some other thing, so as humans, like we have agency, right? And so we can kind of reason with each other, we can talk to each other, we can tell each other not to do certain things. And not that we always do that, but at least we have that type of agency. But with respect to cars, insofar as they don't yet have those type of agency, then this raises the question of whether we should be ceding that type of control to them when they cannot make those type of decisions. And if we can't, then, and this is where I was talking about stuff about staggered learning, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe one way to get the type of adaptiveness that we want is to limit where we can use them, right? And so on and so forth. So,
yeah, not to bounce around too much because I made you a promise about where we were headed, but you made me think about the distinction that's often made in AI research between, I don't know what artificial specific intelligences and AGIs, or artificial general intelligences. And it seems like your argument is saying maybe the analogy between self-driving cars and medicine is just the appropriate use of AI at this point is to steady the hand of the physician suturing, or to keep the car from swerving between lanes, but maybe not to drive on its own or do the surgery on its own. So to limit to ASI uses, but not AGI uses. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way of understanding what's happening right now. It's just, partly we just really, we don't have enough, because these algorithms don't really know about causal relations, they really shouldn't be making decisions on their own, at least for now, right? Later on, when they acquire that, and I have other works where I talk about how they might be able to acquire that type of agency, then we can talk, then that raises a whole different set of issues. But certainly the self-driving cars that we're talking about are nowhere near, having that type of, those type of capabilities, at least for now. So
yeah. And to just push a little bit, I mean, now I'm going to ask you to sort of philosophically speculate a little bit, but there's an argument to be made that the sort of science fiction image of the artificial general intelligence, right? The robot who can do a surgery start to finish, or the car that can drive itself with no other inputs, is just that. It's a science fiction, and that just conceptually agency is something that's restricted from mechanism. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about whether or not we are approaching AGIs, or if that's kind of a asymptotic limit to.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't think that so in my work, I actually distinguish between AGIs and human level AIs. So like general intelligence might just mean be able to get around, do a bunch of different things, but that might not be, that doesn't necessarily mean human level intelligence. So, and one way to think of that is think of a mouse. A mouse seems to have general intelligence, has AGI, right? But doesn't have human level intelligence, right? So what's the difference? Like you might think for humans, they have something like moral agency. They can decide whether something is right or wrong, and so on and so forth, beyond just like instrumental reasoning, means ends reasoning. So now, but we can just but what you just said still holds, right? So is it just a fiction? Like whether, it's like human level until AI, is that just a fiction? Is that something that we can reach? So there, my view is it's not a given, but I do think that it could be possible, right? And so one question is how do you get human level AIs, right? So here's a thought experiment and about how we might be able to reach it. So imagine that, say, take you as an example, Jonathan. So, take me as an example. So imagine that right now there are a lot of scientists who are working on something called artificial neurons. Okay, and so artificial neurons are not carbon-based; they're sort of organic, but they can kind of interact and kind of mimic all the brain, the brain functions and so on and so forth. our current neurons, the biological neurons. Now, imagine that, say I have early onset Alzheimer's, and the doctor said, hey, look, part of your brain cells are dying, right? But now we got this artificial neuron, we can kind of replace some of them, right? Would you like to do that? And I said, sure, go for it, doctor. And so the doctor replaces some of the neurons, and I go home to my family, and I'm totally fine. It seems like I'm totally fine. I still retain my consciousness. Like it all went smoothly, right? Now, maybe 2 years later, I start to have memory problems again. And the doctor, I go back to the doctor, and the doctor says, your other part, like the other biological neurons, they're dying. They're going, they're sort of like going bad, and you need to replace those too, right? So then I said, yeah, go for it, So now imagine this process iterate until like all my biological neurons get replaced with artificial neurons. Now let's assume that during that whole time, I'm conscious, I'm still interacting with my family, and so on and so forth. At the end of the process, I basically have an artificial brain in my head, right? Now, if that's possible, then so presumably that would be, and then that would be artificial, it would be human level AI, right? Because those be artificial neurons. And then you can imagine that maybe with these artificial neurons, we can actually speed them up, right? We can accelerate them. We can add even more, right? And so on and so forth. And so from there, we can start to get to something like super AIs and stuff like that. So I think conceptually, that seems like, that doesn't seem impossible. Whether we're there, whether that's going to happen in the next 100 years, I can't tell you that, right? But what I do know is that artificial neurons are already being developed now. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. The example you're working through is just a contemporary version of Theseus's ship, right? Like you replace the planks, and how many planks does it take before it's a different ship, or is it?
That's right.
Question, except the variant is, now we've added a speedboat motor to Theseus's ship. Is it the same ship? And yeah, so yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the same questions that have come out of bioethics for a long time, questions of human enhancement and editing, are just here in the now neurologic age or information age.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. I promised you a question about explicability, and this one came from an early slide in your presentation about the relationship between the bioethics principles and the addition of explicability.
Yeah.
And I wondered if this question came from me, actually, because I'm interested in whether or not explicability, if normativity sneaks into explicability in the AI framework. So the bioethics principles govern how we treat each other, and then I've always taken explicability to be an epistemic principle, that besides how we treat each other, there's also like how we understand what's going on, the knowledge end. But it also seems like it can't just be purely epistemic, because we're interested in, say, accuracy and precision and transparency in a specific context for a specific purpose to a specific individual. And so I wonder if you could just talk us through a little bit how explicability becomes, if it does, a bioethics principle.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think of explicability in terms of, so one way to think about explicability is just in terms of it explaining things, right? But another is this idea of justification. And this is where I totally agree with you, Jonathan, that there's a normative dimension to it, right? So when we take a sort of a non-healthcare example again, people are trying to use algorithms in sentencing as well, right? Judges are, automated sentencing algorithms, right? Now, one of the issues is, suppose you tell somebody, you sort of say, hey, you're going to get 10 years, in jail, right? And then the person says, well, why am I getting 10 years in jail? And the thing just says, well, that's just what the algorithm says, right? That's what it says, based on whatever, you're getting 10 years. That doesn't seem in some way there's an explanation, but it's like, that's what the algorithm says. But in another way, it's very unsatisfactory. It's not very satisfactory. And why is that? It's because as humans, we need to, like, decisions need to be not just explained, but justified, right? It like justified to us in a way that we think is reasonable. So, you know, there's this whole moral philosophy about contractualism, where we think, you know, a decision, like our ethical decisions, we need to be able to like justify it to somebody, right? Not just explain what's going to happen, but sort of give reasons for why we think this is the right thing to do, right? And I think that normative dimension is very important, especially in this context, where we can go to somebody and not just explain to them, but justify the decisions to them. And that's what the algorithms cannot do at the moment. They cannot provide that kind of justification. And that's why that's why a lot of people are really worried about these decisions, especially for like, I mean, just, you know, imagine it's you, right? And the algorithm says you get 10 years and you're like, well, why am I getting 10 years, right? And there's just no further explanation or justification, right, for, you know, that. And I think you would think there's a problem with that system, so.
Yeah, that's really helpful, right? If a judge were to say to me, hey, the algorithm said 10 years, and I said, well, why? And the judge gave me a very thorough explanation of how the inputs worked in the algorithm and how the system, like to deconstruct the black box still isn't sufficient. I'd want to know, like, yeah, but why that rather than something else, right?
That's right. That's exactly it. Yeah.
That's very helpful. Yeah, because usually when we've heard about explicability, especially around black boxing, it's about how the algorithm works, but it's more than just how it works.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yep, that's super helpful. Okay.
Yeah. And that's where the bioethics comes in, right? It's like, it's not just like, it's not just telling me, oh, the algorithm is looking at this feature and that feature and stuff like that, right? It's about the principles behind, like, you know, it's like the normative principles, the bioethical principles behind them, and whether they're applicable in this particular situation, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I've got follow-ups, but I want to turn now. We've had a question from a participant. Matthew,
Sure.
If you're still here, do you want to ask Dr. Liao your question? Still here, but I might go ahead and ask on behalf of Matthew.
Okay.
Matthew wrote, what about in complex medical situations where a second opinion is necessary? He says, imagine two AI devices with the same foundational algorithm. They might have the same diagnosis, which might violate one or another bioethical principles. So I think what he's asking here is, if you want a second opinion and you've got two AI systems that are programmed the same way, you're going to end up with the same output, I think, on his read. So he's asking, like, I think implicit in the question is, will there always be a need for human second opinions?
Yeah. So that's a great question, Matthew, and it gets at the heart of what I was talking about earlier, whether the algorithm can make decisions on its own versus whether it's just sort of an input into our decision making. And I think that just given the limitations of these machines, like as impressive as they are, they're still limited and they still don't have agency and so on and so forth. So we have to think of them as more like inputs into our decision making, which means that they can kind of inform our decisions, but certainly we humans should, like, so some people think humans should always have the input, at least for now, right? With respect to these algorithms. And this is in order to make sure that there's some sort of check on these algorithms and so on and so forth. Now, I will say that there's evidence now. Someone's on. So there's evidence that in radiology, for example, so IBM Watson has a sort of a there's a, you know, sort of they're using this imaging to diagnose cancer at Sloan Kettering, for example, and they found that doctors and nurses are deferring to these algorithms about 97% of the time, you know, and so there's a sense in which like we might, even though we could intervene, we in fact don't. We just sort of say, well, if the AI says it's this, then we just go with that. Like we don't try to second guess AI. And we have to ask ourselves whether that's a good thing, whether medical training should be like that, or whether we need to teach our medical students to double check. And then there's a question of like how we even could double check, right? Like sort of some of these algorithms have become so sophisticated that you have no idea why, why it came up with certain predictions, and you don't know what it's looking. And so so that's an issue as well. And so these are things that are like already happening now, and they're affecting healthcare decisions. And that's why we need to kind of think through. We need to have a way of thinking through these issues. So.
Can I jump in with a comment, Jonathan?
Yeah, please, Dr. Kubler, go ahead.
It was a really interesting point that you just made, Dr. Liao, about maybe the inherent necessity for physicians to understand how the decision-making is being done. But as an educator and someone that teaches chemistry, I would say actually the tendency right now is to go the other way, where increasingly, especially among maybe a student population, but not just confined to students, the question is asked, why do I need to learn chemistry to be a physician? I talk to physicians and they say they never use this. So I wonder if it even informs us on how our educational systems should be done. Just the thought experiment of where AI is going and the limitations that you mentioned in really not understanding what's in the black box and our tendency to over rely on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I fully agree. I think, and it's important to, I think now, I work with the medical school, and they're trying to figure out maybe a curriculum for learning about how these algorithms actually work, and sort of have some sort of basic understanding, so that they don't just rely on the algorithms, or at least they know about the limitations of these algorithms, and so on and so forth. And it's kind of so I'm writing a book right now. It's called The Future Brain, and it's about in some ways about neuroscience. There's some AI stuff as well. But there's a similar debate with respect to neuroscientific technologies especially in court settings. Judges, a lot of people want to introduce neuroscientific evidence into courtrooms, but there's a huge debate in law schools about whether they need to teach students about how to interpret these neuroscientific evidence, because they have no idea. They need to learn chemistry and neuroscience and sort of like how does an fMRI imaging scanner work, and so on and so forth. And so I think those are, as our technologies get more advanced, I do think that we need to train our students, at least in these, these trainings are going to be important.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, the relevant analogy seems to be like, I defer to my doctor's expertise, but if my doctors are referring to AI expertise, that seems problematic. Given what
exactly.
Matthew, you want to go ahead and follow on, please do.
That's Matthew Jacob with his hand up.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I am driving. That's the reason why I try to keep myself quiet. Thank you, Dr. Matthew, for great presentation, and Jonathan and Steve, great opportunity for us to interact. One thing I want to bring also to the table is that I work in a hospital also as a chaplain, and when bioethical issues come in and we go for the bioethics consult, this AI diagnosis involves a lot of human feelings and human vulnerabilities as well, as far as family members have been concerned as well. So that is where I believe that the algorithms need to be considering human and family relational aspects as well. So that was my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's right. I mean, if the AIs are, I mean, that's even more complicated. In an ethic consult, they're usually maybe family members might disagree about certain medical decisions, and it seems even more complicated to think that AIs might be able to, at least current iterations of AIs, would be able to kind of I mean, maybe they can provide some like informational guidance and so on and so forth. But I'll say that AI algorithms right now, there are two things. Like one is they're creating social robots, so like AI, like robotic health caretakers. So in Japan, for example, there have been a lot of, they're creating these, the government's actually investing a lot because there's an aging population and they don't have enough caretakers. And so there a lot of the care work's being done by robots, or they're trying to move in that direction. So that's happening already. And then the other thing is that a lot of companies are working on emotional AIs. So AIs that can read emotions. So right now, and this is where, you know, when I was, Jonathan and I were talking about the AGIs, you might think AGIs could just be sort of this rational thing, but that might be sort of doesn't have emotions, right? So if you want something that's a more human level AI type, you know, certainly we have emotions, and you know, so the type of AIs that are going to interact with us, like, you know, for them to be able to do effectively, they might need to be able to read our you know, emotional states and be able to express emotional states and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thanks, Matthew, for the great question. I'll just shoot. I know we're short on time, but I didn't want to let you go, Dr. Liao, before I asked you about your fundamental conditions.
Yeah.
Take a little bit. Maybe the question's convoluted in my head, but you said you made this really interesting argument, short argument, that if pursuing a good life is of fundamental importance, then pursuing the conditions of it must be as well. And that might include basic health. And that got me thinking, given the distinction between human caretakers and AI in healthcare, aren't there a variety of causal pathways through conditions to get us to a good life? And if there are, like AI might be one, but a human physician might be other, like why think that if both can get us there, maybe like one takes longer or is a little less precise, why think that one is better than another?
That's a great, that makes total sense. And it's a really great question. So, so I was thinking, so the way I think about it was that, you know, like like, you know, I start out by thinking, what does it take to live a good life, right? And living a good life is doing, like pursuing different what I call basic activities, things like having friends and families and sort of knowing about things in the world and sort of active pleasures and so on and so forth. So we got these activities, and you know, they can be more expensive or more restricted. We can kind of talk about that. Now, in order to do these things, we need certain fundamental conditions. We need to be able to think, right? We need to be able to decide to pursue one thing. We need to have the capacity to have interpersonal relationships and so on and so forth. So those are the fundamental conditions, right? And what I am, so in my work, I've talked about how I'm a conjunctivist about fundamental conditions. I think that all those fundamental conditions we would have a right to have, right? Even if we might not end up using all of them, right? Because we could change our mind. And the example I give is like, say a hermit. Imagine you got a hermit who doesn't want to have any friends. I think that he still has a right to have his and you think that, so I think that the capacity for interpersonal relationship is a fundamental capacity. I think the hermit has a right to have that capacity cultivated, just in case he changes his mind and decided one day he does want to have friends, right? And so that's what, you know, makes it a fundamental condition. Now, fundamental conditions, so just to get at your question, Jonathan, they're different. It's true that there are different ways of, there could be different ways of fulfilling those fundamental conditions, right? And so I think my view there is only that the fundamental conditions have to be fulfilled. And there's a separate question of how we go about it, like what the means by which we go about it. And there I'm more open to like, you know, you can imagine, you know, them taking different forms in different cultures, societies, and so on and so forth. So just to give a very quick example, say one of the fundamental conditions is like being able to like basic education, like being educated in certain ways. in order to live in a society is a fundamental condition, right? Now, in our society, that means going through like primary education and so on and so forth. But say if you live in a hunter and gathering, gathering society, it's to learn how to hunt and gather, so the form of it might be different. The specific way of doing it might be different, but the aim is still the same, right? Basically to teach us basic skills to survive in the society. So I don't know if that was helpful. Yeah.
No, it really is. I mean, part of just the drive of my question was thinking that, if we end up in a world where AI could do the work,
yeah,
the possibility should still be a choice, an active choice for somebody to say, no, thanks, I'd rather my human physician do it or whatever, right. Because that could still lead to the same, it could still act as a means of fulfillment. Yeah,
I see. Oh, yeah. Very, very good. Yeah.
Because I feel like oftentimes digital technologies, information technologies like AI are sort of thrust upon us, and we don't have an opportunity to object or step out or opt out.
Yeah.
Super interesting. So one of our students, Shelly McKinney, has a question for you. Shelly, do you want to ask directly? You're welcome to.
Sure. So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. I want to follow up on your question. We were talking about the legal side, and you mentioned that the physicians were very likely to follow the recommendations of the algorithm in most of the cases. Given that's the case and that it's well known, should there be some responsibility shifting from the medical profession to the algorithm for any outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a sort of a very active and live discussion right now. Sort of it's goes under the heading of accountability, right? Like who should be responsible when a self-driving car hits somebody, right? Is it the algorithm that's responsible? Is it the researchers who program? Is it the people who program the algorithms? Is it the company, right? Is it the people who started, activated the car, and so on and so forth. And right now, the prevailing right now, just given that these algorithms are not really completely autonomous, the general approach is to say that companies, researchers are, and maybe even the user are somewhat responsible. It's kind of like a shared responsibility view, right? Where different people, different stakeholders are sort of different, are responsible. So for example, if Tesla advertises that its car can like self-drive, but in fact it can't, and then there's an accident, you might sort of think, well, that's a problem that, it's like bad advertising and false information leading to, these accidents and so on and so forth. And so the same thing you can say about healthcare algorithms, right? So if it's advertised as being able to figure out these things on its own, then you might sort of blame the company for making claims that are not warranted right now. So I don't know if that was helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, in our several of our students have been reading Luciano Floridi's work, thinking about distributed morality and distributed accountability and responsibility, and trying to make those distinctions. And it seems adding the additional layer onto the existing story by including AI makes that even more complicated.
Yeah.
We probably have time for one more question. Dr. Kubler, you had a question about healthcare outcomes, and I wondered if you wanted to ask that one to wrap us up.
Sure, I'll try. This is maybe a little convoluted of an extrapolation, but it seems to me, at least in the US, care outcomes depend very much on what insurance companies will or will not pay for. Insofar as that determines what a physician might offer, that determines what a family might decide is appropriate. And then thinking along those lines, we may or may not immediately have AIs making decisions in terms of diagnosis or treatments in any of the types that you outlined 1 through 4, but AIs may be involved on the back end for insurance companies in determining what are appropriate levels of care. So laying out that landscape, then what can you say about the responsibilities and duties of insurance companies in using medical AIs? And then how do we as a society, or how does the legislature get ahead of that curve?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question and very important one. And so, right now our insurance, our healthcare system has a lot of issues, and one of the issues is sort of transparency, right? We don't really know. It's kind of like the insurance company is a black box, right? How does it figure out whether to cover you or how much to cover you and so on and so forth. A lot of people are really frustrated, right? They can't get a straightforward answer. And the insurance company, they have the algorithms. It's clear that they're using algorithms, but they're not telling you. And, at least some of those, like in some of these cases, they do know what their algorithms are, but they're just not telling you. I can imagine, based on what Steve's question, we could get to a point where the insurance companies can't even tell you what they can just tell you what the algorithms says what should be done, but they can't really explain why it should be one way versus another, right? It's just sort of like, sorry, this is just what these algorithms tell us to do. And that's a very big problem. And so how do we avoid that situation? So there are a lot of people who say, look, we need to make sure that sort of transparency is very important. We understand these how these decisions are arrived. But going back to sort of what I was saying with Jonathan, I also think justification is going to be a really key thing. We need, especially when you deny people, deny them of coverage, or when you limit their coverage and so on and so forth, you need to give them comprehensible human reasons, right? You need to be able to justify to them. You can't just say to them, well, I'm sorry, that's just what the computer said, right? That just doesn't seem right. And ethically speaking. And so we don't want to, that's a case where I think all of us would benefit when we don't live in a world with that type of system where someone just says, well, that's just what the computer says, right? And so we have a choice of how to deploy these technologies and what shape or form these technologies should be, used and so on and so forth. And I don't think that's a given. I don't think it's we necessarily have to go in that way rather than another way. And I think that there are good ethical reasons to think that we should make sure that whatever systems that we adopt, they can kind of justify their decisions to us. So.
Yeah, that's great. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Liao. I really appreciate your time. It's been a really great discussion. I'll turn things back over to Dr. Kubler to wrap us up, if that's all right, Steve.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Liao, for sharing your insights on how AI will change the landscape of healthcare. It's going to be a big change, clearly. Thank you, Dr. Beaver, for moderating our event. And thank you, participants, for really outstanding questions. A link to this presentation will be made available on the UCF Center for Ethics website, so you can view the recording again and share it with others. And there you can also find links to past talks and information on upcoming presentations in Ethically Speaking. And Ethically Speaking, I'll remind you, is made possible by generous support from the many UCF colleges, departments, and units that I hope you can see listed here. I'd like to thank these partners and many individuals in those units who helped bring this series to you. And lastly, thank you for your participation. We hope you're going to join us in future presentations in Ethically Speaking.